Robert, let's get to the juicy one. People have lost their ever-loving minds. It's like people don't really understand what was in the decision, because I said 2% of the people commenting have actually read the decision. It's probably wildly less than that. We're going to go to the Harvard admissions anti-Asian discrimination for the benefit of African-American students. I just want this line. The last stage of Harvard's admissions process, called the LUP, winnows the list of tentatively admitted students to arrive at the final class. Applicants that Harvard considered as cutting at this stage are placed on the LOP list, which contains only 4 pieces of information: legacy status, which I think people can rightly have a problem with, recruited athlete status, financial aid eligibility, and race. In the Harvard admissions process, quote, race is a determinative tip for, end quote, a significant percentage, quote, of all admitted African-American and Hispanic applicants. Robert, just before we get into the decision, which is the right decision, this is basically Harvard saying, we don't think any, I'm exaggerating because it's not all of the African-American and Hispanic students, just the majority of them or a lot of them. They think they couldn't find qualified African-American and Hispanic students. They all needed the tip up with their race. This is Harvard saying what they think of African-American and Hispanic students. It's not, they weren't combating racism. They are the racists engaged in overt discrimination and the soft bigotry of low expectations, where for some reason there's hundreds of millions of people in the States. The majority of the African American and Hispanic students, they're there because of race, not because of qualifications. All right, you all know, everybody knows who's watching this, sort of the fact pattern. Harvard basically was using race not as a factor for the student, but as a prejudicial consideration against other students. So they were effectively penalizing Asian students, Asian American students, in the application process to favor African American students in the application process. They relied on, I'm not sure how far into the precedents or the what's the word I'm looking for, the prior decisions. There's one called Gruder, I think, which basically said affirmative action policies can be justifiable if there's a compelling reason, but they still have to be limited in time. Bottom line, the court 6-3 divided along political lines, said what Harvard was doing was unlawful discrimination. It was a very, very well-crafted decision. Ben Shapiro came out with probably the most biting, sassy diss and said, the strongest argument you need against affirmative action is reading Ketanji Brown's Dissident. It was like reading a story of fiction, where you would think what the court just did was basically penalize African-American students in the application process, as opposed to stop penalizing Asian American students. Robert, what's your take? What's your assessment? And what's your assessment of the meltdown of those in mainstream media who now basically say this sets Black students back 50 years?
Well, I think the reaction is understandable because of the collateral consequences of this decision. That this decision puts equal protection and the original intent of the 14th Amendment back in play across the board. That, as Justice Thomas called it, it's the colorblind Constitution. It's the restoration of the original revolutionary promise that all are born equal and free and shall be treated so before the law. And that we didn't have that at the time of the Constitution up until the Civil War, because a group of Americans, reflected in the Dred Scott decision, didn't get it. Dred Scott Supreme Court came in and said that because of your color of your skin or your ancestry, that you could not be considered a citizen. You could not be considered part of the people of the United States. Now, that's not what the Declaration of Independence intended. That's not what was broadly understood at the time of the founding. That was not what people Lysander Spooner and Frederick Douglass put together in their very good piece called The Unconstitutionality of Slavery in 1840s, which, by the way, as is Justice Thomas notes, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts in 1793 said that the U.S. Constitution's provisions prohibited slavery. I mean, what happened was our courts were corrupted by the Southern planter class, and they abandoned that initial promise. And the 14th Amendment consecrated the completion of the American Revolution into a colorblind constitution where all men are born free and stay free. Even though the Supreme Court had in the Amistad decision reflected that principle, they had abandoned it in the context of slavery and ancestry as it related to ex-slaves. And so that's what Lincoln at Gettysburg, the brilliant book by Gary Wills, talks about the reconstruction of the American narrative to re-embrace all of its people into its citizenry and the American family, and really created the American identity is our liberty. That's what it means to be an American. As we're about to celebrate July 4th, it means freedom. It means liberty. That's what it means. That's when I say I'm an American, it's not because I grew up or was born someplace. It's because I believe in these principles and these precepts. And for a couple of decades, the Supreme Court had abandoned it out of concern over the vestigial impacts of racial discrimination. But what the universities were doing, as Thomas talks about, as Gorsuch talks about, with some wonderful language, is that what's really going on here is that this is a elites protecting themselves and acculturating other members of their elite to look good. So the reality of affirmative action, I know this from personal experience. I was a young student at Yale University. I ended up leaving in protest because they were going to discriminate against poor kids, working class kids. If you needed money to go to Yale, you needed financial aid, they were going to deny you admission based on that fact. And then if you did get in somehow, they weren't going to give you enough financial aid or scholarship aid to get there, even though they raised tens of millions of dollars every year promising to do that from donors that they were suckering in. I led the protest movement while I was there. What you discover is affirmative action was really designed twofold. The primary beneficiary of affirmative action in the Ivy League especially, but a lot of universities, are rich white kids, legacy kids. That's where Bobby Kennedy doesn't know this, doesn't understand this, hasn't done a deep dive on it. Because here's the legacy admissions take up as much as 20% of all the people admitted in the Ivy League, even though they make up less than 5% of the applicant pool. And it ain't because they're super smart. It ain't because they're special. It ain't because they've overcome adversity. It isn't because of any of the things that should matter for character and skill and competence. When I was at Yale, I wrote a piece. I said, next time, when I was a kid, sophomore, junior, said, next time you're in class, you're sitting down next to some student who sounds like a complete idiot. You can pretty much guess that he's there because mommy and daddy got him in there. And I was talking about legacy admissions is the biggest problem in the Ivy League, especially. William F. Buckley, he got his kid in from legacy admissions. Christopher Buckley ain't nothing special. I mean, he wrote a couple of half-assed books. That's about it. But you're there, you realize the number of legacies, the Black and Hispanic students combined are less than the number of legacies and donor-based kids at these schools. And these schools have become bastions of privilege that increasingly working class kids can't even get in. When I got into Yale, the dean of the university, the dean of admissions, put at the bottom of the letter, "It's people like you who belong here." I didn't even know what he meant. I thought it was cool. I got into Yale. I got a full ride. I had private scholarships that would give me full ride, independent of all that. And he let in a bunch of us. Nick Adamo, a good buddy of mine, grew up homeless on the streets of New York City. We all got in. We get there and we discovered that, there ain't a lot. This place ain't the best and the brightest. I mean, Jesse Jackson used to say, "Ain't it the best and the brightest? It's the richest and the whitest." Well, it's not quite the whitest part, but that's who was benefiting from these affirmative action programs. Here's how. How do you continue to do legacy admissions, donor-based admissions, buying access with these fake meritocratic labels put on you for life, guaranteeing you an income for life? Because, look, I got a degree from Yale. I got a degree from Harvard, all the rest, without getting sued for racial discrimination. Because overwhelmingly, legacies are white. Overwhelmingly, now, by the way, they're also WASP, which, to my beloved delight, both Thomas and Gorsuch go right at. Said, the first affirmative action at the Ivy League was to keep the Jews out. That's how they started this whole nonsense. But it was for rich Brahmin wasps, as Gorsuch and Thomas both point out. It's wonderful. And they're still doing it. But the only way they could avoid getting sued is, well, we better guarantee demographically a bunch of positions for people based on checking a box. Because this is their definition of race and ancestry, which, as Thomas points out, Gorsuch points out, this is all made up, right? I mean, the race doesn't exist genetically. Race doesn't exist biologically. This is purely a social construct. And increasingly, you can't even figure out where you're supposed to check your box in. What defines Asian? Asian students were realizing they're getting screwed if they put the word Asian. So if you were from China or India or Vietnam or Thailand or any place else, you skip that and try to figure out something else to identify you're in. This is how Elizabeth Warren's getting promoted. She decides she's Native American out of the box. This is literally a check-the-box method of admissions that they were doing to prevent people from suing them for favoring all the rich white kids, all the dumb rich white kids. Because if these kids could get in on their merit, they wouldn't need legacy bonuses to get in. They wouldn't need donor bonuses to get in. And so that's the dirty, deep secret. And what it is they buy off enough. Here's the other deep secret. Who in the black community is benefiting from this? As Thomas points out, how is it that historically black colleges are the ones still producing all the scientists, all the doctors, all the really people making an impact in the black community? He points out that, I mean, this is, Thomas went there, so Thomas probably has some personal experience with some of the Ivy League and what he thinks about their real race relationships and their treatment of black people and Hispanics, who they benefit here too. But to give an example, Henry Louis Gates, black professor from Harvard, said this. He said, if we made a movie about affirmative action at our prestigious universities, the movie would not be Straight Outta Brooklyn. It would be Straight Outta Brookline, because they were buying off the rich black kids, the rich Latino kids. To give an example, I got a buddy of mine. He's actually a residential dean at Yale. He was my roommate, Puerto Rican. His dad was old school blue collar labor from Flatbush, New York City. And he told me he would complain. He said, all these, he goes, the Puerto Ricans that they've let in here, he goes, overwhelmingly, they come from Spanish aristocracy. That's who they were giving special benefits to under affirmative action. The people he said, these are the people who oppressed my grandparents. He goes, they're the ones getting they're the ones getting the bonus. They're the ones getting all the clubs, all the memberships. What a bunch of garbage. And that's what it really was. It was by black working class were still getting stiffed. Mexican American black working class were getting stiffed. Just like, and amongst the Asians, disproportionately, it was the working class. I mean, I had a buddy of mine at Yale who came from Vietnam. His parents ran a little dry cleaning shop. He was trying to survive while he was there. He wasn't given any special bonus, and it took him forever to get in, or took great hurdles for him. He was part of that class with I didn't know the dean of admissions. I thought he gave everybody a little note. I thought that's a smart move. I didn't realize until I got to Yale, there was only like 30 of us that he'd written that little personal note for. People were like, what, the dean of admissions? It's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But then I got there and figured out why. It's like, these are all rich kids who think the whole world is flyover country. When I started raising protests, they used to tell me that, oh, well, why don't you get in your camouflage and go recruit people in Tennessee? I was like, Deliverance is not a documentary, you moron. So that's the real bottom line, is this has been a class war waged by the elite against working class of all ethnic backgrounds to keep allowing their elite disparate power and influence. The second big impact of this is woke institutions. Because here's the thing, you send a black working class kid, Mexican American working class kid, white working class kid, any working class kid, period, whatever ancestry you want to stick on them, that they're not going to line up for feminist intersectional class, right? They disproportionately come from STEM. They disproportionately go in these other areas. They want to be successful. And part of Thomas's point, the number one sign that a working class or poor kid's going to break out from where they come from is they have an inner loci of control. They believe they control their own lives, not other people. They don't believe the man is holding them down. And that mindset is critical. Their promotion of affirmative action was promoting a ancestry-based view of the world that promoted victimization, that undermined independence, inner loci of control. So it was a multi-level war on the working class, but it was to promote and propagate their woke garbage. Because without all these little rich kids from safe space environments in the schools, they're not going to be able to fill up the humanity and social science classes where they're filling kids with crap in their head. So that's the third impact is as Thomas and Gorsuch both make clear, this applies to every Title VII case. This is a Title VI case enforcing the 14th Amendment that says you can't, if you take federal funds, you can't discriminate at any level on grounds of race. But this applies government contracts, government employment, private employment. It's all of the diversity, equity, inclusion garbage. I think it all, by this decision, a colorblind constitution enforced by those laws mean all of those provisions are unconstitutional. All of those provisions are illegal because this is enforced against private employers through Title VII. And Gorsuch goes out of his way to say, hey, when I did the Bostock decision, all you liberals were with me. And now all of a sudden you want to redefine discriminate because you don't like how it politically benefits? He's like, well, I'm going to let you know right now, it applies across the board. That means race-based determinism is dead. And as both Thomas and Gorsuch remind everybody, race-based determinism is what, he talks about eugenics, talks about Korematsu. They say this is what the elites have always done, is divvy people up. I mean, they even talk about caste divisions and the elites using it to divvy up. I mean, this was a great, great decision for in its rhetoric, its language, its impact, its import. And it's a common sense decision because they were just using a check the box, tell us your ancestry, and we were going to give you a bonus or minus based on that ancestry that disproportionately favored the most privileged of the privileged and was propagating a woke system and a diversity, equity, inclusion, neo-Marxist nonsense that was undermining our institutions of learning, undermining our economy, undermining our society, undermining our stock market. This case is taking out a building block of all of the entire garbage.
I'm not going to go through all of the bad takes on the internet, Robert, but you had Soledad O'Brien, whose father was Cuban and her mother was Cuban and her father was Australian, lecturing an Asian individual on Twitter. I don't know who the person was, who said, you've basically set minority groups back 50 years. And I was like, Soledad, you realize you're lecturing an Asian person saying basically you must deal with the discrimination for the benefit of the group that I want to discriminate against. Bette Midler had possibly one of the most mentally unhinged, deranged takes. She said the Supreme Court will not rest until Black people are back in chains, women are back in the kitchen, and gays are back in the closet. And as fast as they can, they vomit up these crazy pronouncements, snatching away rights we were given and have lived with for years. Robert, I spent some time just screen grabbing a lot of this stuff, so for posterity. One of my concerns, I put the question out in our locals community. It was it Kavanaugh or Gorsuch who put out, the idea that if you want to, analyze by way of essays an individual's life story for the purposes of admissions, there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing in this decision says you can't do that. So, have essay submissions. You can determine from one's life story whether or not they have defied the odds, fought against the machine and won, and thus allow them, admit them because of character on an individual basis. Some people are saying that's just a workaround, or they're fearing that is the workaround, the wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Here's how you do indirectly what we just said you can't do directly. Any legitimacy to that fear?
There's none, because here's what the Supreme Court said. Right after they said, look, this was the other mindset, massive shift here. They said no more collective judgment, no more ancestral judgment, no more blood benefits, no more blood libels. Done. Everything that what our America requires. This was a celebration of individual liberty across the board. Said that's what the 14th Amendment means. That's what America means. That it's not just the colorblind Constitution. It celebrates the individual, and you cannot be judged by aggregate traits. You can't be judged as being part of some group. They said it demeans the dignity of the individual.
Mm-hmm.
But what they said is, look, you can always, as part of your individual story, as part of your character and your application to, say, admissions or to any other program, it may be relevant what adversity you've overcome. And that adversity may include racism. We're not saying you can't reference that. And they point out that if you show that a particular place has discriminated based on race, that a remedy can be some form of affirmative action, but it has to be specific and private. Specifically and directly tied into it. But here's what they went on to say. They said university, this is a majority part of the majority decision. Universities may not simply establish through application essays or other means the regime we hold unlawful today. So they cannot use that path. Here's what they got to do. They got to take out the boxes. It's that simple. If they leave those boxes in for the admissions process that check the box which race you are, they're going to get sued again and they're going to lose again. Like all these cities and states that have tried to screw with gun issues. What has that done? That has led to over 100 decisions striking down even more gun laws than likely would have occurred if they would have kept their mouths shut and just obeyed the law. It opened courts' eyes to how deep the problem was because these legislatures are so dumb, they go out and yip. And Harvard's already yipping in ways it's going to regret. It quoted one part of the decision, decided not to quote that part. So if they leave in that box, if there's anything inside their system that is still checking Black, Hispanic, Asian, white, whatever, Native American, Native Hawaiian, they're going to lose again. They got to get rid of the box. And what it also means is government employers need to get rid of the box. Government contractors need to get rid of the box. Private employers need to get rid of the box. BlackRock chose a good time to stop using DEI and ESG terms because they're going to get sued for what they're doing because of how broadly impactful this law is. But it's also a celebration of the individual. So when I got into Wisconsin law school, the Black law school dean had already instituted this kind of policy. He'd already looked ahead and said, we're not going to do affirmative action. We're not going to make the definition based on race. We're going to make everything an individual essay in terms of that part of it. We'll have our, what's your LSAT, what's your grades, what's your college references, and that'll be one category. And the other category will be, tell us who you are as a human being and why you think you can use law to make a difference. And he once told me that my application was one of the more debated and discussed ones. But he did that. And by the way, he created a very interesting, diverse our law school class. We had one of the more diverse, if you wanted to look at it from a color perspective, but it was particularly more diverse from a class perspective of people that were there. Many of the Black students I knew who went to law school with went back and served in the working class communities. A buddy of mine that was a Mexican American at Yale, he to this day works in the Mexican American community, not some NGO garbage, but doing real work. He's a guy who works. He could make huge amounts of money. He doesn't. He'll barter with people. People say, "Oh, I'll bring you 4 chickens." It's that kind of bartering that he does for people that can't afford representation otherwise. That's who's going to start getting in, because what the Ivy League doesn't want to tell anybody, all these universities, all these people promoting it don't want to tell you, is that all of this is for privileged kids. They're not helping. As Thomas points out, he goes, in fact, a great line. He goes, historically, Black colleges have still done far more for poor and working class minorities than Harvard ever has. That was a nice sticker right to it. These people aren't trying to help the disadvantaged. They're trying to screw the disadvantaged. And that's why they had it coming. And if they try to get around it, they're just going to get hammered and sued into oblivion and writing checks to the other side until their eyes roll back.
Some people had been accusing Clarence Thomas of hypocrisy because apparently he benefited from affirmative action, according to the accusations. I couldn't independently verify.
That's false.
Okay.
Clarence Thomas grew up, very Black independent grandfather that had a strong impact on his life. He was an honors student in a Catholic school when he was very young. He was an up-and-coming Black intellectual from day one. So he like Thomas Sowell, these people never needed it. And that's his other point. His other point is that people like him are still being judged by these race-specific programs that are meant to diminish Black achievement, meant to diminish Puerto Rican and Mexican achievement by making it seem like race is the reason why they're there. Mm-hmm. Now, Kamala Harris probably got to where she got because of people checking off boxes. Still the dumbest lawyer I've ever met in court, but not Clarence Thomas, not Thomas Sowell, not plenty of others. And I can tell you from a trial lawyer perspective, some of the best trial lawyers in America are Black trial lawyers, but very few of them went to Ivy League schools. Some did, but still most of them went the local track. Why? Because they're not looking for working class kids. Again, if affirmative action was supposed to help the disadvantaged, why is the entire Ivy League more upper class today than it was 50 years ago? So and I'll get a quote for the people that doubt the impact of this case. As it was put in the case, this case is meant to, quote, end all such discrimination. And it was talking about the whole society, that's what the 14th Amendment means, to end all such discrimination. no matter where it is originating from. So I get why the left went berserk, because some of the smarter ones, know what this means. That at the time their diversity, equity, inclusion is peaking, the Supreme Court has just slammed the door on it and opened the door. America First Legal is right now looking at lawsuits across the country in all kinds of industries related to every aspect where this could have an impact: employment, stock market, government contracts, admissions at any level, all of it. And so that's where I think it was, but brilliant. I mean, it's 200 plus pages, but brilliant. I really recommend Thomas's concurrence and Gorsuch's concurrence. Like, this was this is absolutely true. It said these programs were designed, if you look at their origin and history, to quote, perpetuate, in the original ones, screwing out the Jews, perpetuate the purity of the Brahmin race, New England's white Protestant upper crust. I love that that's in a Supreme Court decision, because that's what they've still been doing. They just wanted to make it look a little better with a few more different colors around the table, but from the same privileged background to promote the same agenda of the same privileged communities. So this decision is a revolution as much as the 14th Amendment was a revolution, as much as America was a revolution. That's why it's the perfect case for July 4th.
I was going to say, from a gawking, sort of rubbernecking look at the crash on the highway type perspective, read Ketanji Brown Jackson's dissenting opinion. It's written like someone who,
it's a pitiful defense where she cites false facts, because the reality is she was one of those people. Hey, we'll put you in a position of power as long as you play by these rules. So she's benefited from it. Thomas would have got there anyway. Thomas never considered himself owing anything to this crowd, and in fact felt they misled him and mistreated him in many respects. And that, I mean, there's unusual dropout rates. I mean, of the students that are brought in that are Black and Hispanic to these institutions, because they're not there to serve them. They're there to buy off a few Barack Obamas so they can continue to stay in power with this elite group.
All right. Now, Robert, if I looked lost for a second, my computer froze and I didn't hear anything for about 10 seconds way back when. So if anybody, I wasn't sure if everyone still heard you, but it doesn't look like it interfered with the stream.
Well, Thomas finishes great. This puts into writing, finally, all men are created equal and are free and will be treated as equal and free before the law. That's what this case is about. It's about individual over ancestry. It's about accomplishment over checking a box. It's about promoting the core of the American Revolution and making the Constitution read in the words it was written in, to paraphrase the one and only Huey P. Long.